Maya had never been so scared in her life. The car ride had been long, and now she sat in a small apartment in a town she didn't know. Her father was always busy with work, leaving her to settle in alone. She missed her old house, the one with the big backyard and her old friends. But now, here she was, in a new town with new people, and it felt like everything was different. Maya looked out the window at the quiet street. The houses were all so close together. It was nothing like her old neighborhood. Her father had told her that the new place would be nice, that they would make new memories. But Maya felt unsure. She wished she had something familiar to hold on to. She walked to the window, looking out at the green garden next door. There was a woman outside, bending down to water her flowers. The woman looked kind, with gray hair pulled into a bun and glasses perched on her nose. Maya felt a small spark of curiosity. Maybe she wasn't the only one feeling alone here. After a while, Maya heard a knock on the door. Her father opened it, and the woman from next door stepped inside. "Hello, I'm Mrs. Davis," the woman said, her voice warm and friendly. "I live next door and wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." Maya's father smiled and introduced her. Mrs. Davis was a little older, with a gentle smile and kind eyes. She brought over a plate of homemade cookies and invited Maya to sit with her on the porch. Maya wasn't sure what to say at first. She had never met someone so friendly and eager to talk to her. Mrs. Davis, however, didn't seem to mind. She asked Maya about her old home, about the things she liked to do, and she shared stories of her own life. Maya found herself laughing, feeling the warmth of Mrs. Davis's kindness. It wasn't the same as being with her old friends, but for the first time since they'd moved, Maya felt a little less alone. The next few days passed in a blur. Maya went to school and came home to find that her father was still working long hours. Most afternoons she spent with Mrs. Davis. They would sit on the porch, talking and watching the sunset. Sometimes Mrs. Davis would bake cookies and let Maya help, teaching her recipes passed down through the years. Maya loved the time she spent with Mrs. Davis. It felt like a safe space, like she could talk about anything. Mrs. Davis never judged her. They would laugh, share stories, and even talk about their dreams. Maya learned a lot about Mrs. Davis's life, about the family she had lost, and the memories she held close to her heart. One afternoon, as they sat together, Mrs. Davis asked, "Do you have any friends here yet, dear?" Maya looked down. She hadn't really thought about it. At school, the kids were friendly enough, but she didn't feel like she had made any real connections yet. She missed her old friends, and it seemed like no one really understood her here. "I don't know," Maya said softly. "There's a girl at school. Her name is Clara. She's new like me." "Well," Mrs. Davis smiled, "why don't you invite her over here? We could all have tea and cookies together." Maya's eyes brightened. "That's a good idea. I think she'd like that." Later that week, Maya invited Clara over after school. Clara was a bubbly, confident girl with short, messy hair and a big smile. She was always talking about something new, whether it was a book she'd read or something funny she'd seen online. Maya liked Clara's energy, but there was something different about her too. Sometimes, Clara would talk about things Maya didn't quite understand, things like her expensive clothes or the latest gadgets. When Clara stepped into Mrs. Davis's house, she hesitated. Mrs. Davis was sitting by the window, knitting something colorful, and her home was filled with old-fashioned things. Clara looked around, but said nothing at first. "Would you like some tea, Clara?" Mrs. Davis asked warmly. Clara nodded, and Maya could see her relax a little. She took a seat at the table, and Mrs. Davis poured the tea. They all sat down to enjoy the cookies Mrs. Davis had baked earlier. The conversation turned to school, then to books, and soon enough, everyone was talking and laughing. But Clara's smile was a little forced. She wasn't quite sure what to make of Mrs. Davis, and her eyes darted around the room as if searching for something more exciting. As the afternoon wore on, Clara grew quiet. She kept glancing at her watch, and Maya noticed she didn't seem as interested in the stories Mrs. Davis was telling. Later, when they were walking home, Clara turned to Maya and said, "You really like hanging out with her, don't you?" Maya nodded. "She's really nice. She tells great stories." Clara rolled her eyes. "I don't know. I mean, she's old. It's kind of weird, don't you think? I don't get why you want to spend all your time with her." Maya frowned. She didn't know how to respond. She liked Mrs. Davis and felt at home with her. But Clara was her age. She wanted to fit in with her new friend, too. As the days went by, Clara and Maya grew closer, but something started to change. Clara often teased Maya about spending too much time with Mrs. Davis. She would laugh and say things like, "Why don't you spend time with someone your age, Maya? Mrs. Davis is nice, but she's not really someone you can hang out with forever." Maya felt confused. She liked Clara, but she didn't want to lose her special bond with Mrs. Davis. Clara would often make fun of her, saying that hanging out with old people was uncool, and that Maya should focus on making more friends her age. "Why don't we do something fun?" Clara suggested one afternoon. "We can go to the mall and grab some ice cream. Forget about Mrs. Davis." Maya felt a knot in her stomach. She didn't want to hurt Mrs. Davis's feelings, But she also didn't want to lose her friendship with Clara. The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of discomfort for Maya. She was spending more time with Clara, but every time she did, a small part of her felt like she was leaving Mrs. Davis behind. Clara kept insisting that hanging out with someone her age was the only way to have fun, and Maya, eager to fit in, started to question her choices. One afternoon after school, Clara invited Maya to hang out at the mall. "Come on," Clara urged. "We can shop for new clothes and grab some ice cream. It'll be so much fun. You deserve to have fun, not spend your days baking cookies with an old lady." Maya felt a twinge of guilt. She didn't want to disappoint Mrs. Davis, but she also didn't want to lose Clara's friendship. She remembered the afternoons spent with Mrs. Davis, baking cookies, listening to stories, and feeling safe. But then she thought about how happy Clara made her feel when they hung out together. She didn't want to miss out on having a friend her age. Maya hesitated. "I don't know," she said softly. "I really like spending time with Mrs. Davis. She's like family to me." Clara's smile faded. "Family? Maya, come on. She's just some old lady. You need to hang out with people your own age." Maya felt her heart race. She didn't want to hurt Clara's feelings, but she didn't know how to explain to her why Mrs. Davis meant so much to her. There was a warmth in Mrs. Davis's house that she couldn't find anywhere else. There was a sense of belonging, a place where she could be herself without fear of judgment. But Clara didn't seem to understand. She pressed Maya again, saying, "If you want to be my friend, you need to make a choice. You can't spend all your time with her. Choose, me or her." Maya stood still, unsure of what to do. The decision felt heavy on her shoulders. She didn't want to lose Clara, but at the same time, she knew she couldn't abandon Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis had always been there for her when she needed someone. And now, when Clara asked her to choose, Maya felt torn between the two worlds. The following day, Clara invited Maya over to her house. Maya had agreed to spend more time with Clara, hoping to make her friend happy. As soon as Maya entered Clara's home, she felt a difference. The house was much bigger than Mrs. Davis's, filled with expensive furniture and decorations. There were no flowers or cozy corners to sit in, no homemade cookies baking in the oven. It felt sterile, cold. Clara's mother greeted them with a distracted smile and a quick nod, not offering to sit down or chat. It was clear that Clara's family was busy, each member wrapped up in their own world. Clara's younger brother was sitting on the couch, playing video games, while her older sister sat at the dining table with her phone, barely acknowledging their presence. Maya looked around, feeling uneasy. She had always been used to warm, inviting spaces where people took the time to talk and listen to each other. But in Clara's house, it felt different. No one seemed to care about what anyone else was doing. It made Maya wonder how Clara could spend so much time in a home like this. Clara led Maya to her bedroom, which was filled with posters of pop stars and piles of clothes. As they sat on the bed, Clara started talking about the latest trends, the coolest apps, and all the things Maya didn't really care about. After a while, Clara's tone shifted. "You know," she said, "my mom and dad are always working. My brother is always on his games. It's like no one cares about anything." Maya's heart softened. She didn't know what it was like for Clara to have such a busy family. She had always known her father was working a lot, but at least he made time for her. She could talk to him, and they would spend time together whenever he was free. Clara didn't seem to have that. But Maya didn't say anything. She just nodded, unsure of what to say. That afternoon, Clara didn't seem to pay much attention to her. She was on her phone most of the time, and Maya felt like she was invisible. She began to realize that while Clara had a lot of things, she didn't have the one thing that mattered most: the warmth of real connection. Clara seemed to be missing something that Maya found so important in her friendship with Mrs. Davis. Someone who cared for her deeply. Someone who listened. As Maya left Clara's house that day, she thought a lot about the differences between the two worlds she was living in. Mrs. Davis's home was filled with love and care, while Clara's was full of distractions and empty space. Now, from this point, the story will be continued